Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast, and good morning to those on the West Coast. I'm Van Scholes. I'm from the Keystone Policy Center, and I'm excited to have so many of you join us with a conversation with an amazing group of national leaders to talk about how best to measure school quality. As you all know, school quality measures serve a variety of purposes. They can inform parents and community members about local schools, can help policymakers and others monitor school performance, and help guide us when we need to intervene, provide supports, and sometimes accountability around how to get schools to do better for our kids. And we thought here at Keystone Policy Center and our partners at Future Ed that with US achievement in decline in many places or stagnant in others, we decided to approach the school measurement from scratch. We now know a lot more in the last 10, 20 years about what are the features of schools that really work best for kids and community. We organized sort of a summary of these findings in a report that we put out, I think it was in May, Quality Check, the new best ways to measure school quality. And not surprising, student achievement as measured by standardized test scores emerged as a key indicator of school quality, as they are included in all of our states. But the research also identified additional metrics that also predict student success in school and beyond, measures that offer a more complete picture of school quality, from students' access to rigorous instruction, effective school staff, a safe and supportive learning environment, sort of the culture of the place, and students' post-secondary outcomes. We've got an amazing panel today. We're joined by former Secretary of Education and the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center, Secretary Margaret Spellings. We also have Tequilla Brownie, the chief executive of TNTP, Francis Messano, the chief executive of New Schools Venture Fund. And then we've got Chris Walters, who's a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. And last but not least, we'll be joined in about 12 minutes from Colorado's Governor Polis to join the conversation. He's going to come into the conversation and then unfortunately has to leave, as he is a governor and apparently has other things to do. Let's, if we could we start with you, Secretary Spellings? Given all that you know, all that you've worked on these issues for many years, what do you think? Are test scores too dominant? How is it that, what should we be emphasizing or changing, adding or subtracting in 2025, knowing where we've been over the last couple of decades in terms of school performance?
Well, thanks, Van, and thanks to both organizations for sponsoring this webinar and the work. And I'm encouraged that there's no one on this call who doesn't think that assessment and measurement and what I call caring enough to find out matters. And that is not what, while that might have been once universally shared, I think there are plenty of people around on the left and the right who think we don't need to be doing any of this. We don't need to find out where the kids are and whatnot. And my concern about that is, if we don't have a problem or understanding, then we don't need a solution and we don't need resources and we don't need, et cetera, et cetera. And that will be to the great detriment of kids. So congratulations for, this event that keeps us in this conversation. And sure, as you rightly say, we've learned a lot since the enactment of No Child Left Behind and various other things that have happened since. And I think, as I think about it, there are some cautions and there are some things to be mindful of. Okay, so what is the right level of the mandate? I mean, I cannot imagine that the federal government would mandate a mental health indicator or set of indicators or some of these other things that you all speak to. But I can imagine, and I think it is as sound today as the day it was enacted, that paying attention to reading and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school, and reporting that information in a disaggregated, transparent way is still more than appropriate. And I hope that thesis will hold, and counting on everybody on this call to continue to embrace it, because we have known how to use a federal role better than we have in the more recent past. You don't have to take my word for it. You can just look at the NAEP data. And from 2000 to about 2015, 16, the Bush and Obama administrations, we were going in the right direction. We just flat were. And there's all kind of discussion about cause and effect and whatnot. I'm just looking at the data. So I think it's right to have a federal mandate that requires transparency and disaggregation, a focus on every kid. And I think that hangs with a federal role that is essentially a civil rights role. The other thing I would just say is we have to be mindful that, as my former boss used to say, when there are too many goals, there are no goals. So, the part of this is, what is the right level of emphasis on particular indicators? Where should they come from? Who are they useful to? And what is the policy purpose? So I think this is the right conversation to have at the right moment. And you all probably know we at BPC are stewarding something we're calling the Commission on the American Workforce, co-chaired by former Governor Deval Patrick and former Governor Bill Haslam, and populated with all manner of Illuminati and the K-12 and higher ed arena that will help us develop a talent strategy for our country that we will birth early next year. So look forward to signaling all of those recommendations at the right time.
Thanks, Secretary Spellings. Is there anything that you would add now if you're doing NCLB over
Oh
again?
gosh. Well, I think, as you rightly
Like
say, I mean,
something
we've
like,
come a long way, with respect to what technology can do. As you said, I mean, we write laws or policies based on what we know at the time, and that was 25 years ago, my friends, and we've learned a thing or two in 25 years. So, how can we get more timely information? How can we, but to educators, to parents, et cetera, how can we make it more actionable, et cetera? So I think there are some improvements to be made, but I'm going to die fighting for a requirement for annual assessment, disaggregated data, and carrying enough to find out as a matter of federal policy.
great, thanks. Let's, Tequilla from TNTP. You guys have looked at, thousands of schools serving kids who start out below grade level, and helping those schools for those kids to make progress. I was just wondering, can you talk a little bit about what you've learned from that, and what stands out in terms of those schools in terms of making progress, and how does that translate into metrics or what we might be able to see from the outside?
Thank you, Van, and thanks for having me today. I want to first just echo and reinforce Secretary Spelling's reminder that we should not in this moment sort of discount that we all understand the importance of data and metrics. I couldn't imagine a CEO in the business community not wanting data about how his or her company is performing, right? How many widgets are you getting out the door, how and why? And so as we translate and apply that same principle, if you will, into education, it is essential for us to understand how we are doing and why. This is where I think we get caught up on the destination without understanding that the journey of how we arrive at the destination is equally important. So to that point at TNTP, for almost 30 years, we've been looking at that intersection of research, policy, and practice and how they come together to really drive outcomes. And so, as you said, we've spent, these 3 decades getting insights directly from schools, working on the ground with them, asking the essential question, like, what makes a great school? And we start with a foundational belief that great schools do, in fact, change a young person's life trajectory. They catalyze economic and social mobility for students, which in turn strengthens our very nation and our communities. And so in Opportunity Makers, one of our recent reports, we looked at the data from about 28,000 schools. Now, interestingly, out of those schools, only about 5% were what we call trajectory changing schools. And what that simply means is that schools where a student started below grade level and made more than a year's worth of growth in that year, right? So that's when we think about growth. In fact, those schools were making about 1.3 years of learning in a year. That's how you help students catch up. And so what we found in studying those schools is that there were 3 really key themes. Students that started behind could in fact catch up. And as we think about where our outcomes are right now, we have a crisis at hand because the majority of our students are in fact behind grade level. We all know this didn't start with COVID. We see the data. It started, really reversing, as Secretary Spellings said, in 2013. And then it absolutely was exacerbated by COVID. So in these schools that we found that actually have a consistent pattern, a decade's worth of data showing that they help kids catch up, the 3 practices that we found: coherence, consistency, and belonging. Coherence simply means that leaders are giving people what they need, young people what they need. They're having aligned systems, everything from curriculum, assessment, and the interventions, and they're all rowing in the same direction. And so what students are learning every day is bridged across what they're learning in out of school and in other sectors as well. The consistency, again, young people are receiving what they need every day. It's not like, once a year, right? They have a great day. They have consistent, good, stacked days. And then finally, belonging. This is where we have to recognize our young people, they're not just data points. And this is where I think some people who don't understand the importance of accountability and of data think that we're over-indexing on data points. This data is actually to be used to leverage what and how we can improve in order to improve the very life outcomes of our future leaders in our nation. I'll stop there. I saw Governor Polis join us, and so I definitely want to pause, Van, and let you welcome him into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. Good morning, Governor Polis. Thanks for joining us. We're so excited to have you here. You've been working on issues around school quality for decades. I remember you doing some of this work on the State Board of Education in Colorado prior to being congressman and prior to you being governor. And I wanted to call out your work recently with the National Governors Association, Let's Get Ready, that included actually work from, I think, most of the organizations on this call, including the Future Ed Keystone report. And it sort of talks about how states can organize their education students or their systems to prepare students for higher education in the workforce. As I wanted to just sort of start out, Governor Polis, with this question around, we're working in both directions. We're talking about what quality schools are, and then how do we know when we see a high quality school? What are the indicators? And this has been, I think we've learned a lot over the last couple of decades about this, and hopefully our insights, we're hoping to translate these insights into sort of new policies around how we think about it, and wondering where you are thinking about quality indicators for schools. And again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Van. Good to see you. So, of course, it starts with some of the work we already do. We make sure kids are proficient in math and reading. those are tested, and we don't do well enough, and we know that. And there's examples of excellence where kids from underserved backgrounds achieve at high levels in math and reading. There's other examples where tragically too many kids are falling behind. But I think one important point to make is where it starts with, of course, those proficiencies, and we in no way want to make sure that the rest of the discussion detracts from that. We do need to add to that. There's a lot more that is needed for successful outcomes than just being able, literacy and numeracy. One of the areas we identified in our report is civic engagement, and there's a fight every year in Colorado. We try to keep the social studies test, which we do at 2 grade levels. There's always people who, either because they want to save money or not know what their kids are learning social studies, are trying to eliminate it. But it's also about outcome-based measurements like workforce readiness. And are students getting good jobs? Are we training them with the skills they need that employers want, either directly out of high school, often aligning with some sort of certificate or skill certification, or if they're going on to higher ed, how can we make sure that they are successful at that higher ed level and don't need remediation?
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about, one of the challenges that we have is we have often in most states, we have different systems and we have higher ed, we may have some labor data, and then we have K-12, and we may have some ECE data. These are all different systems. High school, we're looking at, let's say, proficiency levels in high school, which again provides some useful information, but it doesn't often tell us how kids do in higher ed, or certainly not in the workforce.
Absolutely. The systems need to talk to one another better, and it needs to be more seamless. Early childhood you brought up, we need to see what early childhood practices lead to success in school. We know the correlation between high quality early childhood education and prevent the achievement gap from occurring before it occurs. And Colorado stepped up with universal free preschool and kindergarten. Just in the last few years, we moved from 28th in preschool enrollment to 3rd. But even better, we'd like to see the outcome of that free preschool as students enter 3rd grade, 4th grade, and also how much endures through high school and beyond. Likewise, of course, connecting higher ed to K-12, workforce to K-12. I'll give you an example. There's long been a proxy that's been used to evaluate higher ed of student loan repayment rates, which is fine. Obviously, generally speaking, if you have a job and you're doing okay, you're paying your student loans, and if you are unemployed or aren't, you're not. But it's certainly not a perfect measurement. And we don't often have that for students that are directly out of high school without student loans. It seems a very indirect way to be going about it. We should and we can talk about how it can be tied into, for instance, unemployment, UI, how it can be tied into making sure that students are able to have job placement out of high school. There's a variety of indicators. If we can more seamlessly, in a way that protects people's confidential information, provide helpful data about what works and doesn't work in our schools.
How do we balance, Secretary Spellings brought up this point earlier about there are lots of important things we should probably be measuring, and some of them are more important than others. And how do we get away from having a zillion things that are important, from mental health supports to job placement, et cetera, and not lose track of what's important?
Yeah, certainly reading and writing are foundational. That's why they're so important. And we often say, in the early grades, you learn to read, and then usually, hopefully after 3rd grade, sometimes 4th or 5th, you read to learn. Reading is foundational. Basic numeracy is foundational. But employers in today's world are looking for more than foundational knowledge. They're also looking for critical thinking. They're looking for particularly certified skills. And we have a lot of great opportunities for kids in high school to get certifications concurrent with their high school diploma. It could be in medical fields where they can be a phlebotomist or a nurse assistant right out of high school. It could be in traditional vocational tracks. It could be in new areas like cybersecurity and programming, where kids right out of high school are sometimes able to land high 5 or even 6-figure salaries if they're highly proficient in areas that are needed in the private sector, in a skills-based economy with skills-based hiring for many of the major tech companies to make sure that they can identify talent where they are. Certainly outcomes in terms of being able to support yourself, have a job, the skills you need to do that are critical. It's hard to show up for many jobs and say, yes, I can read and I can do basic math, hire me. Yeah, there's some jobs like that, but that's not where much of the job market is. It requires some degree of either specialized information or at least what employers are looking for, kind of soft skills and critical thinking, ability to deploy technology as a tool across the sector. So those are the kinds of things we should be looking for. I think looking at outcomes in terms of employment, in terms of success in the workforce. You mentioned kind of mental health. I think rather than as an input, we should be looking at lifelong well-being as an output. Are students healthy? Are they self-assessed as happy and content? There's a wide variety of things that can do that. It may or may not be a quote unquote mental health intervention. It may just be like having clubs for them to meet people with at their school and being able to pursue their passions. It could be classroom practices that where too much stress isn't put on them. It could be how to handle stress. So there's a lot of things to do. I would lean towards measuring outcomes rather than inputs, and say we should not be saying every school needs to do this for mental health or that for mental health.
Yeah, there are a lot of folks that have thought that there's too much of an emphasis on testing and there's not enough space in the curriculum or space in school report cards or what have you to share some of these other things. And I was curious either if you, Governor, should we be doing every grade every year?
Yeah, well, I've never really understood that argument at all, because what we have now is what we would call no stakes or extremely low stakes testing. There's no consequences if your kid doesn't want to take the test, if they're sick that day. If they do take it, whether they pass or not does not affect their grade. So that's what we do with standardized testing. It does, of course, give us information around what is working and what doesn't working at the systems level. That's different than the learner level. We hope that the tests are also useful to inform the individual learner level, and part of what we need to do there is simply faster turnaround of processing, so the student gets the teacher gets the test back. There is room for some consolidation, by the way, there, because districts do often content area testing, states do content area testing. In many cases, the state content area testing, that the results aren't even available till that teacher till the end of that school year, or even till their student is even there the next year. So there's the pedagogical benefit for the student level, but we're also, again, looking at systems and what works and doesn't work for numbers of students, expanding with the goal of expanding and replicating what works, and equally as important, often harder politically, changing what doesn't work. What is not preparing children for success needs to be changed, looking at proven models it could be the same demographic of at risk or not at risk. We know examples of what works, and we need to expand and replicate those.
So
Ben, if I could jump in one point just to click on what the governor is saying. In this era, I think we forget that there was a time that we did not know that third grade reading was a very strong correlate to outcomes, right? And now that we know that, we have that empirical evidence base, we know that that's a critical mile marker. So as both we heard from the Secretary and from Governor Polis, we know that what young people need and what our employers and industry leaders need, absolutely, academics is foundational. In isolation, what we talk about in our paths of opportunity research, in isolation is actually insufficient, because even for young people who experience poverty, who had strong academic outcomes, only about 58% get to a living wage by the age of 30. That's barely a coin's toss. So so it's not much better for middle class kids, right? It's only 63%. So that tells us that our education system needs to continuously improve. And so the rationale for continuing to invest in both the resources around the data and analyses, but also the supports and intervention, is for us to build an understanding of what actually does work. Yes, academics is absolutely, that's a non-negotiable, and what else? And so without that, we will continue to read false signals, if you will, and continue to measure, 100 things rather than, I love how Governor Polis framed it, understanding, measuring to outcomes, but we need to understand those leading indicators along the way so that we can really invest appropriately.
great. But I want to be clear, though. It sounds as if there may be an opportunity here to have, let's say, a little bit less of what we've been doing in terms of standardized testing most subjects every year, um, uh, without a lot of stakes. I think your point is well taken, and also having better feedback mechanisms and so on, and having an array of other indicators added to it.
Yeah. I don't think I don't think we want less information from testing. I think where the opportunity might lie, and it's a minor one in the scheme of things, because we really need to do is tie, transparency and outcomes. But if one of the goals is to say, okay, let's spend a little less time on testing, the low hanging fruit there would be, how can we get some of the same student level benefit from state testing that districts feel they need to get from their district level testing. And so, on top of state testing in districts across the country, there's often district level testing. Often, I would add, because they find the state testing either too slow, insufficient, or not often enough. So yeah, there's a little room there. I mean, it's a very minor thing, but sure, maybe there's a way where, kids could have a little less time in testing, and we could find out just as much or more.
Yeah, and Van, often a red herring. I mean, the federal mandated,
Sure.
reading and math, grades 3 through 8, one time in high school, report it, disaggregate it, and so on. So maybe we've had a little bit too much of a good thing that is, driven people crazy. But, as I listen to this conversation, we are so woefully short of the table stakes entry, basic reading and math skills, as you said, Tequila, that we got a long way to go. So this idea that everybody's a good reader and can cipher, but they lack soft skills is not accurate. So how do we do all these things? And Governor, have really admired your work so very much, and I hope that the NGA will keep the flame lit on these things, because we are certainly in the era of local control and state leadership. And come on down, governors, because it's
Yeah.
against the law to improve student achievement.
No, it's a great point, Secretary. We generally know, thanks to looking at reading and math across different grade levels and universal assessments, we know that many students are not at grade level. We also know that some students are. And I think what we're talking here is about two things. One is, clearly we haven't done enough for students to achieve at grade level in math and reading. Clearly, there's examples of excellence. There's schools with underserved low-income populations where 90+% of the kids test at grade level. Sadly, there's others where 30%
Yeah.
are at grade level. So we have those. I think what we also need to do is, okay, let's look. First of all, every school should be a school where, I hope 100%, but 90%, pretty good, are at grade level in reading and math. Then how do we also look at that next step to say, you got reading and math, how can we also make sure you have a successful career, are able to support yourselves? What type of skills, what type of certification of those skills, what type of access to higher education that ties into employment do you have, in addition to having basic literacy and numeracy, which are absolutely foundational?
Amen.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Are you around for another minute or two, Governor
Sure.
Polis? Okay, great. What is it? What else what are we missing in this conversation?
So, I mean, part of our call to governors is states need to lean in, especially with the federal government leaning out, which, again, I disagree with this. I think we need national, on multiple levels. We need national competitiveness. I believe in, Secretary Spellings, you did a great job in the Bush administration. That's what we talked about. We want a competitive economy nationally. We care about that. That's a national priority. At the same time, we also care, Democrats and Republicans, about individual opportunity. Absolutely. Anybody from any background should be able to work hard, get ahead. Nobody should be trapped in a persistently failing school. So, I mean, these are broad values that governors share, Republican, Democrat. We want our states to be competitive. We want to have a competitive advantage in human capital and the skills and talents of our people. The most important thing we can do as governors in our states. We also deeply care about, I believe, Republican and Democratic governors, individual opportunity, that no matter your background, your wealth, your race, you should have the opportunity to work hard, get a good education, get ahead in our state, in our country. So with the federal government withdrawing from a role on that, states are big funders of education, and it's for almost every state. It's the biggest line item in the budget. Now, it's a combination of state and local. The feds are usually 10%. They're not as much, but states, in our state, it's Some districts 40%, some lower income districts it's 60% state funded. So we drive the funding. With funding should come accountability, meaning we will not continue to persistently fund a failing system. We want to make sure that we fund success. We want to give our districts the flexibility to do what works, but not the flexibility to do what persistently fails students.
Amen. And I mean, here's the other thing I would just say that yes, competitiveness, opportunity, but we really cannot forget about the civil rights imperative that is the federal role. And without that, I'm concerned that, it's sort of a, every man for himself sort of thing, and that we lose that, urgent imperative around opportunity for everyone everywhere that, has been in our, ethos for many decades and is a little bit shaky now, maybe, but we gotta, we on this call need to really embrace that and, help lead the way forward, not remind our fellow Americans about the importance of that.
Yes, and another in an area that is sometimes included in civil rights, sometimes isn't, but I think is very appropriate to include is making sure the federal government continues with its responsibilities under IDEA to make sure
Yeah,
that the learning needs of every student with special needs are met in every school district in the country. And that's very much part of the civil rights commitment that the federal government makes to learners across the country.
So, Governor, you would not be in support of the complete abolishment and obliteration of that office at the Department of Education?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think it's good to talk about it with a civil rights frame. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But I think absolutely meeting the learning needs of and by the way, there's been great breakthroughs in the last years and decades in successful early interventions for kids with learning disabilities. Great science and data that lead to much better outcomes, even than a couple decades ago, when they're delivered particularly early for the student, particularly diagnosis and appropriate learning at a young age. Just been tremendous progress in the science. The field has not fully caught up with that.
Yep. Amen.
Now, I'll just add, and if we stop understanding how, as the governor and the secretary are saying, like how good schools are getting those results, then we cannot scale and replicate that goodness. I hear a lot of, people talk about going study other systems in other countries. Great. I'm sure we can absolutely learn from some, Finland, Sweden, right, et cetera. And we actually have really good schools here in our own country that are actually performing well, that we don't do enough to study. And again, yes, absolutely the data and the accountability, but also again, I feel like we lose often the conversation around how to continuously improve, understand what works, replicate and scale. And we don't invest enough, I believe, in understanding that so that we can scale. So I just want to bring that balance also alongside, because they're both equally important. And that's the only way we're going to improve schools is on the ground.
I agree, Tequila. I would say we probably as a nation have maybe a B- or C+ on expanding and replicating models that work. We have an even worse grade on changing models that don't work. We're probably close to a D- or F. We just let them fail students and families in our most at-risk neighborhoods year after year. We're a little better at expanding and replicating, but we should be an A on that. I mean, that should be an easier thing to do.
Completely agree. Yes.
Yeah.
Totally agree, Governor.
Yeah, there's something unfortunately unique in education as a sector. We have enormous difficulty sort of looking across the classroom or somewhere else and sort of saying, how can we take the best from this and do even better? And with that in mind, I wanted to sort of bring Francis into the conversation from New Schools. You guys have a portfolio of amazing schools where you're experimenting, the schools are experimenting, creating new models, and you've learned a lot about what makes a great school and what should be included in the measurement of good schools. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for bringing me in there, Van. I was, I want to be respectful of the governor's time. And I was like, I have a lot to say on this front, on the new models front, because as you mentioned, what we are doing at New Schools is that we're helping to fund and provide support to new public schools, both charter.
Hi, Governor.
Bye, Governor.
Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Governor
so much
Polis.
for joining us.
And so we're playing a role in helping to get these new models off the ground and then have an in-depth research approach to understanding what they're doing so that we can help replicate best practices. And so much of what's been coming up in the conversation are also foundational principles for us, because we envision a future where all young people can grow into the leaders and problem solvers that our nation needs. But we know that to get there, young people have to be equipped with knowledge, skills, and the agency to shape their own path, so that they could be economically stable, so that they can be engaged citizens, and so that they can live healthy and purposeful lives. And so what we've been thinking about is, yes, we need to make sure that these new schools are at a minimum helping young people to build a strong academic foundation, right? That has never been up for debate for us. But we also know that young people need a broader set of habits, mindsets, and skills, competencies like persistence, growth mindset, communication, critical thinking, so much of what the governor's been talking about, because they're the same skills that employers say that they need. And so what we've been thinking about is, how can we from the start support innovators in developing and designing those new kinds of models? And then how do we equip them with the kinds of data that they need so that they can continuously improve what they're doing on a day in and day out basis? And so what we've done over the last decade is analyze data from more than 35,000 student surveys that we've conducted across our network, 20,000 academic assessments, and we've run correlations across both academic results, these competency development areas, as well as what we know is key is that young people can't learn if they don't feel safe, if they don't have strong relationships with adults in the building, and if they don't feel like they belong. So what do we know about the culture of those schools as well? And what we found is that when students feel safe, when they do have those relationships, when they have a growth mindset, when they can manage their stress, their academic performance rises sharply. And we've seen significant movement it's like the equivalent of moving from the 50th to 67th percentile on a nationally normed test. And we see when students say that they're in a really strong culture, they're getting additional months of reading growth. We saw that students during the pandemic, especially middle school girls, when they felt like they had strong social and emotional competencies that they've developed, it was a protective factor to academic and learning loss, right? And so what we're seeing is strong academic foundation, the opportunity to build these critical skills in a positive school environment matters mightily. And so what our school leaders are doing as they're building those environments, like we've found a lot of commonality with the work that Tequilla and the TNTP team has been doing around a couple of key ingredients that are in place. Visionary leadership, a clear sense of what is the end goal, what's the definition of excellence, and then creating a culture aligned to that. Building strong relationships, teachers to teachers, teachers to students, students to students, relationships with families, right? That being a foundation for learning. Effective implementation. So teachers using high quality instructional materials, high expectations, and then providing meaningful support. And then finally, a culture of learning and continuous improvement. The data is used not for compliance, but for reflection, innovation, and for growth. And so what Tequilla and I were actually just together last week, and we're like, there's so much that we're seeing as we're studying the best performing schools, high quality schools, and how do we bring all of that together to really drive and inform where we go next?
Great. Can sort of getting at some of the culture and sort of student perceptions, how are you doing that? Are you doing that through surveys?
Yeah, we're using student surveys. And so we're asking students to rate themselves and how they feel like they are developing in a range of competencies. We're asking them to share their own reflections on their school environment. And then we're running correlational analyses with what we're seeing on academic achievement on a student by student basis to see what patterns we can identify. And then we disaggregate that data, right? In the same way you've all been talking about, it's actually the disaggregation that becomes this really powerful tool for change, right? For continuous improvement, looking at it by grade level, gender, race, English language acquisition, whether a student has an IEP, and trying to say, what is this telling us about the experience that young people are having in their school and where are their opportunities to improve?
Great.
So
if I could add, Van,
in our school dashboard.
I'll bring you back in, but Chris has been a patient academic, and I'd like to get his perspective a bit about what research is telling us, and in particular, the research that you've been involved with at Blueprint, and your own research from an economist perspective, from an academic perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ben. It's
So-
been a great conversation so far. So I think, my perspective, thinking through these issues, I think it's often interesting to start with what is not predictive of school success, or at least less predictive than might be commonly thought, which is the level of economic advantage and other background characteristics of students at a school. And what I mean by that is the academic literature on measuring school quality, or at least my little corner of it where I work, is fundamentally about trying to deal with the issue of selection bias. That is, student populations are very different across schools. People are not randomly assigned to schools. So if we just compare unadjusted outcome levels on test scores or anything else we want to try to measure about a school without accounting for that fact, that's usually a pretty misleading picture of what schools are actually doing in terms of promoting student outcomes. So at least as I see it, that's kind of the first order issue in almost any school quality measurement system, which is how can we separate the school's contribution to student success versus the contribution of everything else that's going on that's different across schools, family background and poverty and things like that. So with the work with my collaborators at Blueprint Labs, a lot of what we do is about trying to fix that problem by finding some kind of natural or real experiment where we see kids randomized to one school versus another, either through a lottery or some tie-breaking mechanism as part of school assignment, so we can be more confident that what we're measuring is actually the school's contribution and not something else that's different across the kids. And when we do that, what we often see is that the schools with higher levels of outcomes, including test scores or college attendance, anything else you want to measure, are not necessarily the most effective in terms of promoting student outcomes, even though they tend to be the most popular among parents. So that's kind of the first point I wanted to make. And then second, well, if the kind of schools that are performing at high levels are not, if that's not predictive, what does predict longer term success? In some of our recent work in New York City, we tried to make some progress on that question by using these methods to sort of isolate schools' contributions to different outcomes and correlate longer versus shorter term effects, meaning what shorter term measures are predictive of which schools are helping to get kids to graduate and go to college, and longer term outcomes like that. And what we found is that traditional kind of test score value added type metrics that do adjust for how kids were doing before they get there are predictive of longer term outcomes like college success. So the schools that are boosting test scores are also boosting graduation and college attendance. But there's a lot of variation in that's left unexplained. So there's also a lot of schools that are effective at improving college outcomes that are not picked up in test scores. Another component of that work was to try to look at school climate surveys in New York City also, which are kind of a growing tool that's getting used in a lot of cities and other places in measuring school quality. And what we found there is a more nuanced picture. So measures of quality derived from surveys were less predictive of promoting college attendance, but we did find that they're quite predictive of high school graduation. So it sort of suggests that there's different kids on different margins of need, and maybe the kind of the characteristics that are getting picked up in school climate surveys are important for kids who are kind of on the margin of finishing high school versus not, whereas test scores seem to be pretty good at picking up which schools are promoting long-term success measured by college.
Great. Secretary Spellings, did you want to comment?
Well, what I wanted to comment on was the discussion we were having, or that someone asked in the chat about the NAEP as why can't we?
Just so I could share.
To this particular issue.
Yeah,
No, I mean,
yeah. I'm
looking at the same stuff that Chris is.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I'm gonna switch over and try and include some audience questions in our chat. There was an audience question because Bella is taking those questions and putting them into our chat just so people know logistically what's going on. And there was a question around using NAEP as a replacement for state testing, sort of. And so Secretary Spellings, if you want to comment on that, and if anybody else would
Yeah,
like.
thank you. I would love to. So the NAEP, prior to No Child Left Behind, not every state participated in the NAEP. And so it was 30 states this year, different 30 states the year following and whatnot. And with that law, now every state participates, and that's really important. And it's been a check on the system and the quality of state tests. But as Governor Polis rightly said, most of the resources are spent locally, states and locals, and they have an assessment regime that is attached to their own curriculum, their own standards, their own materials, et cetera. And that is right and righteous from my point of view. I mean, the idea that we would have a one-size-fits-all federal test, it's a norm reference test, not a criterion reference test that can be taught to, if you will. And so it's not really designed for that purpose. There's a lot of discussion, as you know, going on with respect to choice implementation and whether those instruments are going to be adequate for accountability for tax dollars spent in other sites and settings. And I think they're very, very imperfect for that purpose. They're really good for what they do, but they are not a test designed around a curriculum bought into by teachers and educators, aligned to state standards, to legislative prerogatives, to materials, and frankly, quite transparent to parents, educators, and policymakers.
Great, thanks, helpful. I want to sort of circle back a little bit to what Chris was sharing around value-added models and growth versus proficiency, and sort of it as a leading indicator of important longer outcomes in terms of post-graduation and that sort of thing. Should we be tweaking up? A lot of states do have growth as a factor in their school report cards. Some de-emphasize it, some emphasize it a little bit more, but I'm not aware off the top of my head of a state that has growth as the leading indicator or weight it more than proficiency. Should we be weighting it as much or more than proficiency in our test scores?
I mean, Van, when we talk about returning to the states and local control, I think, we want to keep the federal role right and proper. And I do think those are well calibrated, or can be well calibrated by states as they think about, where are they driving that combination of proficiency and growth. I mean, what you might see in a Massachusetts is very different from what you'd see in a Texas. And so, I think it's a critically important indicator. I'm the one that put it into the ability for No Child Left Behind standards to be met with a growth standard. So I'm a believer. But I think I'd be loath to sit up here and describe a one-size-fits-all calibration of growth versus performance.
Yeah, okay, got it. Here I'm looking at, so we had a question around, do we need to change policies related to teacher quality and credentialing and that sort of thing? Sort of, where are teacher policies related to the school improvement question?
I'll say two words: states do, and I'll leave it to the people who are working in states to talk about that. It's not a federal thing.
I thank you, Secretary. I actually was going to jump in here on 2 points. The one thing I would say, with just the reminder, growth and proficiency aren't competing metrics. I know sometimes people pit them against one another. They're actually chapters of the same book, right? I mean, proficiency is like, did a student cross the finish line? growth is, did you move them closer to it? Both of those measures are equally important and for different reasons. As Secretary said, where NAEP serves one purpose, and then state, assessments, even formative assessments, right? Even leading indicators, others, right, serve a different one. And so to your point about, the teacher reform movement and some of the teacher policies, I love when Francis was talking about some of their work in their amazing schools, and you asked the question like, oh, do you actually survey students? One of the findings we have at TNTP, we actually triangulate data. Our opportunity series of research, we actually look at what teachers perceive about the school culture, the instructional culture. We have a validated instrument that we've used for years, but then we actually triangulate that against what we're hearing from students. And it's fascinating where a teacher thinks that this is happening, but when you go to the student and ask the student about their experience, it's like tales of two cities. This was before we had all the AI algorithms, right? So it's like the different reality, right, that a teacher has versus a student. And so as I mentioned that's important to have an understanding of how those teacher reform policies and practice, et cetera, are being implemented, but we have to study those in relation to, are they moving the needle on what matters? And is what's happening with a student with their experience changing. I often, cite our former president, where we talk about the soft bigotry of low expectations. And we see, if we only look at teacher moves and not what students are actually experiencing and through their own voices, but then also in the outputs and outcomes, then we'll never understand how pervasive that still is. One of the things we find, to your point, access to grade level instruction, like that's not did I get it right, but literally, did I simply give students a chance to do grade level work? Just giving them that opportunity correlates for all students with higher outcomes. And so those are the types of teacher policies, as we think about what teachers should be doing in practice, how they translate to meaningful outcomes for students.
Thanks. That's super helpful. And it's also super helpful to be reminded around sort of two chapters in the same book around growth versus proficiency and direction. We have a couple of questions here. And I had a question in our report that Future Ed and Keystone put out, sort of talks a bit about this. Should our indicators, should we have one set of indicators for all schools, or should we think about indicators and school metrics differently depending upon where schools are and what the purpose is, whether or not it's accountability, whether or not it's elementary versus high school? We point out some of the research that shows that high school students having access to college level work or work experiences and those sorts of things is really important, and sometimes is and sometimes isn't included in indicators around what a quality high school is. I think the surveys, for example, can be really useful, but we're not, at least our sense of it and talking to folks, we don't think that information should necessarily be included for high stakes accountability, let's say for low performing schools. It may be and should be used in terms of understanding, in terms of school improvement. And we should be doing more of that. So panel, what do you guys think? What should we be doing? Should there be a suite of indicators depending on the circumstances in the school and where things are on basic indicators? What should states be doing?
I'll just start quickly and say, I think as policymakers and as parents and consumers of public education, we want something that we can easily understand and compare. And I think once we start slicing and dicing and saying, well, rural schools are only expected to do this or urban schools that, is a very slippery slope. And so I think we have high expectations for every kid, and we ought to design systems that hew to that thesis.
So, and again, I want to be clear. I wasn't suggesting that we have different standards or expectations for rural schools versus urban or whatever, but maybe we should have different levels of indicator support depending upon where, assuming that schools are at a basic level.
Well, I think that's a big assumption that schools are to basically.
Okay, they're not. Most are not, but
But,
fair enough.
um,
Fair enough. But
I
I
mean,
don't.
it doesn't make sense, obviously, for high schools to us look at the level of rigor and so forth. Sure, of course it is. Again, this is like who's calling the tune? Is it the federal government, the state government, the local school board, whatever? But sure, fair point.
I mean, I think about any policy instructor, policy professors would say, you assess a policy by the answering the question, is it yielding your outcomes? And so, we raise the bar around proficiency growth, as Secretary said, and we're focused on getting more kids graduating from high school, graduating on time and, at grade level, right? And now that we have more data and understanding about the penultimate, if you will, life outcomes for young people, we see that academics is no less important, but we also know that there are other things that are important. And so this is why I actually think I love Governor Polis's work with the Let's Get Ready initiative and the other governors, because it's an opportunity for governors to look across the suite of services and programming that are available to, all communities across the state and identify what all needs to be true for a young person to ultimately end up with a thriving life, which again, therefore strengthens the community, the business sector, and our nation as a whole. And so I don't know that I would say it's differentiated what the bar. I think the answer is sort of what interventions need to be in place for different schools or different, depending on where they are, again, from that growth versus proficiency or growth and proficiency sort of mindset, I would say.
Yeah, what I would just add to that too, I think, I'm constantly separating what should be in our accountability systems versus what are the kinds of things we need to measure based on whether, it's an elementary school, it's a middle school, or it's in high school. There are a range of things that I think we need to be measuring to understand whether we're on track to our ultimate long-term outcomes, but it doesn't mean that it needs to be in our accountability system overall. And so, for example, as we were talking about all the workforce readiness skills or the competency development, we should have a sense of whether young people are building that. Does that go into our accountability system? No, we're not advocating for that, right? But we also know that there's certain things that need to be true, that we need to ensure that our young people, once they graduate with a high school diploma, that diploma is meaningful and is actually driving to those long-term outcomes. And so how do we then separate what goes into our accountability system, but what are the kinds of things that we should be assessing regularly so we have the kind of feedback, the data, the information that we need to be continuously improving? And so the other last point I'll say here is, I think one of the biggest impacts that we can make is in connecting our data systems, early childhood, K-12 through post-secondary. So many of us are riding blind as we really think about whether what we're doing is working for young people. We need that information to be able to backward track, to be able to refine and improve the interventions that we're putting in place. And so wanted to underscore that point as well.
We're almost out of time, but we had a question around the role of class size and teacher certification and credentials and its role in all of this, and if there should be. And I'll throw it over to the research guy.
Well, there's multiple questions there, a lot of interesting things that I can't cover in 2 minutes. I guess what I would say on teachers is a couple of facts from the academic literature that I find striking and important in this area is, first of all, teachers are incredibly important, and there's huge differences across teachers in the amount that they impact student outcomes from year to year. And second, that's often very hard to predict with observed characteristics like certification or background or anything like that. So some teachers are extremely effective in a way that you might not know on paper. And so in my view, one implication of that is that we should be very interested in attracting and retaining the highest quality teachers, kind of let people select in and do the job when they're passionate about it, and make sure to make teaching an attractive proposition for the highest quality instructors.
And also maybe be careful not to include things that might be false positives in terms of long-term indicators. We've got a minute left, and I was just wondering, what have we missed? What any panelists have anything that you want to push out to our audience that wasn't included in the conversation around school quality metrics?
Van, I don't know that we missed anything. I would just say that, we, the band of reformers who have been in this vineyard and care a lot about poor kids and the quality overall in our entire country, need to stay on the battlefield in this moment, because this is not the conversation that everyone is having. And, we owe the enterprise our good thinking, our lessons learned at the School of Hard Knocks in many cases. But seriously, we're at a critical moment about, do we care this much about every kid? And let's not, lose sight of that.
And the only thing, Van, I would add to that is that, and it's actually about all kids. The data is predicting that this generation is the first in our nation's recent history predicted to be worse off financially than their parents. So this is not just about any one segment of the population. Every parent should, and every citizen should be very worried about if we don't turn this crisis around for all students, because all students are actually not going to be well if we don't.
Exactly.
Well, thanks. I think this conversation lays the groundwork for these bigger, more important questions around what's a quality education, quality workforce, and how we can have a successful democracy as a nation. And school indicators, while seeming kind of wonky, and you can quickly get into the weeds on this, is really important. And we need to have some broader conversations around these things and also understand them so that we might be able to build some ground to get to the next level and stop this slide and get back on a growth trajectory with our kids and with all of our kids. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Bella and Tom at Future Ed for leading the charge on this work. And thanks for joining us. And we'll be in touch with some resources and follow up and other stuff. So stay engaged. Thank you.